I'm Steve Reeder, and today we are interviewing Jeanne Shupe for our segment of Monrovia Moments. And as always, is being filmed by AP student and film and broadcast student Owen DeWeese. And the first question we have here is, what year did you graduate from Monrovia?
1961.
And you are one of our more unique interviews because we have you because of your, you lived in Hall and you went to the Hall Elementary.
Right.
So give me a little bit of history about when you attended Hall and the way the building was structured.
Yeah. Okay, I have some notes to read from. I started school down there in '49, and at that time, first and second graders were in one room, third and fourth graders in the middle room, and fifth and sixth graders in the what we called the big room, and which was upstairs of the old schoolhouse. And of course, we had to go outside to the bathroom, and but we'd have two classes in each room, and then downstairs we would have the cafeteria and also the coal furnace room. And the janitor, why, he would keep the fire going with the coal, of course, and at lunchtime we'd sneak in and talk to him, and that was always a neat thing to do. And but we'd have just one teacher, of course, for first and second, one teacher for third and fourth, and then the principal taught the fifth and sixth grade. And I went there for, of course, for 6 years, and then we went to Monrovia and junior high. Of course, we got to junior high then in Monrovia, and high school. And of course, at the high school at the time, we didn't have the gym. We would go uptown for gym for our phys ed class and for graduations and practices like that.
So kids who lived in Gregg Township went to Hall,
right,
first through sixth grade, and then everybody in Monroe and Gregg, for the most part, went to Monrovia because it wasn't officially consolidated until 1968.
Right.
And then your the gym that was the old gym downtown that
Correct.
you had PE in.
Right. Yes. And then the school buses, I was thinking about this one time that we would have just one route. Of course, later on it was two routes, but one route. And when the bus would come past my house, this would be when I'd be going to Monrovia, the bus would be full. And I was the last one on the bus. And so I would have to stand up. There would be probably another kid standing up. And then once we get to to Hall, well, we'd have to switch buses to go to Monrovia. And then in later years, it was so that there was two routes and so forth, and I don't know what year that was, but I know when, and then of course when I was 16 and had my driver's license, why, naturally I would drive, and of course park out, of course, where the old schoolhouse was, where the bank is, and of course we park right along the road because just a few of us at that time had a car. And so we parked there, and of course that was a big deal, get to drive and park at school.
And you guys parked where the current post office is at now, correct?
Well, a little bit further to the corner.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
And then the one thing that's so unique about Hall, and you and I have somewhat talked about this, I went to Monrovia my entire school, and I was in Monrovia's first kindergarten in 1980. Oh. And we had, the only time we ever interacted with students from Hall was in Little League sports.
Oh, yeah.
And then in seventh grade, of course, they came to the junior high, like you had mentioned, and I didn't understand that there was somewhat of a rift between the Monroe Township and Gregg Township, and it wasn't really until I started teaching that was there. And you had kind of commented that people felt like the Monrovia kids looked down on the Hall kids, but then the Hall kids looked down on the Wilbur kids, and the Wilbur kids didn't really have anybody to look down to.
Exactly.
And I didn't really understand how intense this was until I was talking with someone from Hall, and they informed me that they were the Hall Tigers,
right. Oh,
and their colors were black and white, and I was not aware of that riff at the time. What was your first day in junior high like in Monrovia?
Yes, that was real exciting. Of course, it was a big deal. You had to have a new outfit when you started school, whatever grade that you were in. And so big deal. And of course, at that time, all the girls wore real full skirts, and you'd have crinolines, and you'd take up a lot of room. And I was telling Steve that on the school bus, only one other person could sit with me because of my big skirt. So of course, the first day of school at junior high, I was all excited and nervous about going to a new school. And we got to school, and I started up the steps, and the first thing I did, I fell. Here, this big skirt went every which way, and that was my big impression of first day at junior high at Monrovia, falling up the steps, going to school, trying to be so cool, which I definitely was not cool.
The one thing that has come up in conversation is 4-H.
Right.
And there's been a real strong effort by people in the community to revive 4-H, and also a very strong commitment to revive the FFA program here. And the one thing people in the community comment about just how impressive our 4-H program was. And you actually have possession of the first program.
Right.
So explain the 4-H fair and all this.
That was started in '58, was the first year of the fair, and it was held down at the school, which was the old school. And they had tents up, and it was a 2-day affair. And when I was in school, we didn't have sports. We didn't have football. We had basketball and a little baseball team. But in the summertime, everybody belonged to 4-H, because the majority of us kids lived on farms, and we have farm animals. And of course, at that time, your major thing in 4-H was for girls would be cooking and sewing and food preservation and all of those, and gardening. But the boys would always have animals. Well, Romines, several girls had animals too. But the farmers in the community, most of them were fathers of the kids that were going to be in 4-H. Why they wanted to have this big, it was a big to do, and 2 nights, and we had, I think they had some kind of, maybe some kind of rides, but they had games that, where you throw darts and so forth. The different organizations would put up for a fundraiser why they wanted to do this. And all the women, why they made all the food, everything was homemade. And it was a really big deal, because your kids were really in 4-H, and you have a 4-H meeting, once a month. Then you have junior leaders. All of us kids wanted to be a junior leader so that we could be a leader. And it was just and it was to train us how things would look before we went to the county fair, because at that time the program was to be very have plenty of knowledge and experience with your animals or with your projects that you had. If there was a problem, you would learn about it in the local fair. And so Mooresville would have a fair, Monrovia, Eminence, all of them would have the local fair. But the farmers, there used to be, the way the township was set up, you had a township trustee, and then he had an advisory committee that took care of various things, and all these farmers were in this advisory committee. And so they banded together and got the gates and the tents and all of that. And it was a 2-day affair, and it lasted for several years. And I know I didn't have any livestock, but I had other projects there. And like I said, it was just and of course the county fair was always a big affair. But when I was in school, I mean, you didn't have summer sports. Of course, we didn't travel a lot, but so our big social event was 4-H, where you'd have your friends and you'd learn something, and of course everybody had to have a demonstration, and somebody had to be the safety leader, and you had to give a safety report, and it was really a good learning experience, and so forth, and that it was really, and like I said, in summertime, you only had Bible school for 2 weeks, you had 4-H, and you had swimming lessons. And that was the extent of our summer activities.
And you got out of school earlier,
right.
And school didn't start till
Labor Day.
Right. And so you had a full summer.
To do things, right. Because we only had 2 days of Teachers Institute in the fall, short Christmas break, and needless to say, we didn't have a spring break. Possibly we got off Good Friday, and that was the rest. So that's why we could have a.
And so they used the school property essentially.
Oh, for the 4-H fair. Oh, yeah.
And then they used the school building, correct, for some of the sewing and
well,
stuff
yeah,
on
for
the
all
side.
the basement was full of displays, because normally you took several projects in 4-H, and so they would be displayed, and of course they would have someone that would come and actually judge, because they judged just like they did. Well, of course they started 4-H again last summer. They had to revive the 4-H fair, which was like one afternoon, about 2 hours. But they'd have someone to come and you get a ribbon and so forth, and then all the livestock, you have a livestock show. They'd hire someone to come, and a professional to come and to judge the livestock. And they had, because it took 2 nights, because Romines, like I said, there were 3 Romine girls, and they had sheep, and then we had cattle, and of course the Dillons were involved in that, different ones, and had cattle, hogs, sheep. I don't think anyone had any goats, but I mean, it was a big thing.
Now, when you were in school, the basement was the cafeteria?
Correct, yes.
And because the people really speak pretty fondly of the old school, and at different times it was, of course, the gym, and then the cafeteria.
Right.
And then when the elementary was built, there was a cafeteria with that. So the basement, at one point in time, became like a rec room for high school students. One thing that's kind of interesting, talking to various people in the community, it seems like one thing that kind of makes Monrovia a little bit different is when the community wants to do something, like start football or get a gym built, they just really go all out and work together. And it seems like 4-H was the same way. It seems like there's a huge community effort to improve their chances at the fair. And I know in some of the material that you have loaned us, and Ruth Watson had said the same thing, that basically the Monrovia kids did very well at the county fair during that whole time period too.
Yes, because they always wanted to go to the state fair. And I can't remember, I don't think I had anything I took to the state fair. Now that the grandkids, they had things to take to the state fair, but I don't think I got to go to the state fair. Of course, I always went to visit, of course, but I don't think any of my exhibits got that far. But yeah, all the Monrovia kids did really well, because particularly with their livestock, because that was really, of course, a lot of them were breeders and so forth, the livestock, and so they wanted, their kids wanted to show, you know.
So I know you mentioned that the county fair was a big social event. Did a lot of people from Monrovia go to the state fair as well for the social event? And
well, probably. Oh yes, right, because of course the state fair was always later. It was like Labor Day weekend back then. And we would go to the state fair and visit and so forth. Oh yeah.
Now, your family has been in Hall for a long period of time, and one thing that's been really neglected in these Monrovia Moment videos is information about Hall.
Right.
So if you could, we know that Hall, really, people started moving to that area shortly after, or about the same time that they went to Monrovia. You know, early 1830s, people moved there, and then Hall becomes an official town in 1861 and is named after a Zachariah Hall. And Randy Marsh and I have actually found a Zachariah Hall that was killed during the Civil War. Now, we don't know if it's the same Zachariah Hall. And then Randy always mentions how Hall had a brass band at one time that came in second in the county one year. But the one thing that from the reading you've done, you've mentioned some of the businesses that were in downtown Hall. So what were some of the businesses that Hall had at the time? Okay,
I went back to a reference and I did some research and so forth. And what I found out that even before it was platted, in 1851, 1852, there was a general store there. And I don't know exactly where in town that was. But then they had a Geist mill, which I thought that was really interesting. And the research I found from that, it was 1869, and a sawmill. And then there were wooden storefronts along the east and west road in Hall, and then also a little bit north. Well, when the fire came, and I looked up here, the fire was in 1918. And I asked someone that was researching, I said, did they ever know how the fire started? And they said no, that wasn't in the research, but all the wooden buildings, they burned. Now, of course, the church was on down a little bit further at that, well, I guess it was there at that time. Yeah, the church was there at that time. And of course, it didn't burn, but all the storefronts that were wooden were burned. And then then I found out that in Mr. Whitaker, after the fire, and I didn't find out exactly when they started rebuilding after the fire, but after that, Mr. Whitaker, I thought this was interesting, built a 2-story building, and it had a cement vault in the bottom of the building, the basement, and it was right there on the corner at the crossroads there at Hall, and that later became a bank. Now, I don't know what the bank, Hall Bank maybe, I don't know what the bank name was, but there was a bank there for a period of time, and I can't really find any history on that. But of course, my grandfather, Sherman Wilhite, he owned the store later after the big fire in the early 30s through the 40s. And I found something in my Uncle John's book and I thought you'd find this interesting, that the first radio in Hall in that area was at my grandpa's store. And Uncle John, it was the 23 or the 24 state basketball championship that he heard on the radio in that store. So of course that was much later than the original part of the store of Hall. But it's really hard to find too much information about Hall. Now we have the map of Hall, you know, how it was platted and so forth, but to know, or any pictures, I haven't been able to find any.
Yeah, so there was at various times a bank, a filling station,
A hardware store, yeah.
post office,
That's right.
and then a pool hall,
Yeah, right.
and then at least a Freemason lodge and maybe another lodge.
Yeah,
all at
but
one
see,
point.
that was at a later time. That was all
Right.
after the fire. And of course, that's the part that I remember, which I remember like from the 40s on, was the general store. Now, when my grandfather had it, I don't remember being there then, but because he cut hair and he was a barber, and they had the post office. And of course, my mother worked in the store, but my memories was the store and the pool room, and then there was a little building right by the pool room. There was another grocery store at a short time, and then the pool room, and then on the corner, I remember the filling station. And because my dad would, in the afternoon, why the men liked to loaf, and they would go over and have a Coke and sit at that filling station. But now, when that filling station was tore down, I don't know. But I do remember that, and that was there in the 40s. And then around the corner, there was a garage, which has been tore down. It would be on the north and south road, and it was on the east side of the road. And it was a garage, and at one time, the fire department, this would be back in the 70s, late 70s, the volunteer fire department at Wilbur, which is Gregg Township Fire Department, they got in a big hassle, and so they wanted to have a fire department over at Hall. So they took this garage over and cleaned it all out, and I think there was a fire engine there for a period of time. And that's kind of the history of that part, with the little discussion of the fire department, and so forth. And then after that, why different ones had a regular garage there where they worked on cars and so forth. But when they tore the store down, or tore the filling station down on the corner, why I don't remember what year that was, but I remember it was there in the 40s, because I remember.
So there was the fire, and then they had built some of these structures, and then over time, those had all went away.
Right, yeah, right, yeah.
Now, you had told two stories I had never heard before, and one of them you had mentioned was of the KKK in Hall.
Right, yes, right. And of course, that was what my mother had told, that when she was a girl, why there was the KKK, and they would have their regular white sheets on, and they would go to the cemetery. Now, what they did at the cemetery, other than having a meeting, we don't know. There evidently wasn't any damage done or whatever, just a meeting. And of course, the gossip in town was the one fancy doctor that had the really nice shoes. Why, the story was that when they would get together, why someone would always look at his shoes, and they were just sure that the doctor in town was one of the members of the Ku Klux Klan. But the only information I have about that is what my mother had told me, and so forth. So I don't have any other information about that. So. And
another really interesting story is you had mentioned a connection between Hall and John Dillinger.
Right. And I asked Marlon about that again, so I was completely right. Dillinger, of course, and if you get into the history of Dillinger, which we've gone through a lot of times, was more or less the good guy, because this was when the banks were closing, and of course he stole and broke into the banks, and he was sort of the Robin Hood and so forth. So he and his gang would come to Hall, and now this must have been after he got out of jail the first time, because he was in jail for quite a period of time for a crime that was just very minor at that time. And he would come to Hall, and they play baseball. And one of our friends in town, Dale Dorset, that had Dorset Mill, would tell us that he would come to town with his friends, and some friends there from Hall, be south of Hall. And I was wrong, I thought it was west, but it's south of Hall for sure, where they would play ball. And at that time, there was only one sheriff, or one police officer in the whole town whole county. And they would always kind of let him know he was going to be there, so the sheriff would definitely stay away. And now I don't know which team won.
Yeah.
I don't know any of the scores, but and then also his first wife was from Hall. Her first name was Burl, and I'm not sure how long she was married to him, but for a period of time. And then she remarried, and they lived in Hall. In fact, her husband was the janitor at school, and at Hall School. And whenever Dillinger would get out of jail, why the husband was always so scared that they would come down, or the gang or Dillinger would come down, and the husband almost had a nervous breakdown. They said whenever Dillinger was out of jail, they were just always so afraid that he was going to come back. But he never did.
Now, you're heavily associated with Hall, the Hall improvement and a lot of the work you've done at the cemetery. So give just a brief history of the cemetery there in Hall.
Yeah. Any of you that go to the cemetery, well, you know that way on the far east side there's a lot of graves, old graves that the tombstones, you cannot read the names, and we have absolutely no record of who is buried there. But we did find that the first baby that was buried there was in 1841, which I thought was very, very interesting, 1841. And we found out that even who the baby was a child of this Alan Seaton. And what is interesting about that is that the cemetery, there would be different plots. They would when they plotted it, well, they only had a certain amount of ground, and then farmers would give them so much, and there'd be another section and another section. And with the second section and the third section, why there was a family member from this family. His daughter or his baby was buried first, and then a grandson, and then a wife of his great-grandson. So it has lineage all the way down, which is very interesting. And then, of course, we redid the cemetery in 2010 and got to purchase more property, so it is larger. But then the Improvement Club is another very interesting part, because the cemetery had to have someone to keep it up. And so the Improvement Club was formed in 1915, and which was just a year, about the same year that the cemetery we have records from. And there were several of the farmers in town, and my grandmother was one of the original ones that was on it, and they would collect funds to keep the cemetery up, because at that time, why, of course, mowing and then even the driveways and so forth had to be paid, and the church really didn't have enough money to, because it was deeded to the church, and so they really didn't have enough money to keep it up. So anyway, there were several people in this Improvement Club. They have articles of incorporation, they had an endowment fund, and then back then, and for several years and years, and even through my time, Memorial Day, which they called Decoration Day, you would come to the cemetery and with your flowers, and so the people from the Improvement Club, they would be at that building. They built the building up there, and they'd be at the building with big sign of donations leave at the building, and they had different people would set up there. They had a schedule, and they would set up there like 2 weeks ahead of Decoration Day to take donations to keep up the cemetery. And over a period of time, they had quite a lot of money built up in order to take care of the cemetery, and that's why one reason it looks so nice up there.
And you had mentioned it's affiliated with the church there in Hall.
Right, yes.
And the church originally was on that hill.
Right, and it was in cabins, and then the cabins, they decided to build a building, and then after they built the building, that building burned, and then they relocated down in town. And that's the picture that you have that has the church that has the two doors. One door was for the women, one door was for the men, and it was there for a period of time until I think about the 1900s or early 1900s, and then they moved it, and it's still there. We think it's still there in town, but it's been abbreviated or something, and then the new church was built.
And one really interesting story that you've passed on is about the jet that crashed.
Right, and I don't have the year that happened. That's in that clipping, but I know that my dad and I was standing in the backyard. It probably was in the 50s.
I think it's 58.
It was in the 50s, yeah. And we heard this plane, and of course, then whenever you heard a plane, you usually looked up to see where it was, and so forth. Back then, you didn't have planes like they do now, and. We heard it hit and saw a fireball, and so of course we got in the car, and it was back of the cemetery, and the pilot did bail out, and I forget, he did bail out so far, and he was fine, but there was quite a bit of damage. I don't think it set anything on fire, but it was quite a situation.
Now, one thing, doing the research of Monrovia, the one thing that has really come through are some of the more distinguished alumni. Mm-hmm. And one of the most distinguished alumni I think we can agree on is John Hurt, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Which you're a relative of, mm-hmm. and he was inaugurated in our first Monrovia Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. So go ahead and give us a brief account of John Hurt.
A brief account. Yeah, I don't need any notes for that. Yeah, Uncle John, he was my uncle. And of course he came from a family, there were 4 boys, 1 girl, and it was just strictly a farm family back in the Depression time, very poor, And the advantage that he had, my grandmother was raised by a family, the last name was Rogers, close to Eminence. And they were a very well-to-do family. Mr. Rogers was on the Eminence Bank, and he had stock, and he had he had a farm and so forth. Well, anyway, my grandmother had lived with them, and so when Uncle John wanted to go to school, why, they paid for him to go to school. And so he went down to IU, and what was really neat was that he was at the right place at the right time to meet the right people, to do the right things with enough ambition. And of course, he got to go to law school, and he met a lot of people down there that he worked or eventually worked with. And I need a drink of water. So do we have a break? Do we have a break?
Yeah, he'll just take this out.
Yeah, I talk too much, don't I? So anyway, when he got to school all the way, it worked out. And then after he graduated, why, then he worked with Paul McNutt. Of course, he was a governor of Indiana back in the 30s, and then his dad, he went into law business, and he got into law practice with Governor McNutt's father. And so it's McNutt, Hurt, and then they had Blue, which was another attorney. But it was really quite a success story, because he married a rich gal from Fort Wayne. They got married. He had his law business. Well, then he got the job of being the chauffeur for Schricker, that was going to be elected governor. And of course, at that time, this was back in the late 30s, 40s, didn't have the communication like you have now. So they would drive from one end of the state to the other, back and forth and back and forth. Of course, Schricker always had his white hat on. And so Uncle John would drive him around. So he met a lot of connections in the Democratic Party. So then Schricker, of course, got in. Well, then, of course, John was a lawyer, and he had different business. He was a lobbyist, one of the main lobbyists in the legislature for the railroad companies and all the different companies. And so, of course, he would be at Indianapolis the entire time during the legislature, and that was always a big deal. So then, after that, he went to school with Matt Welch, and so then Manfred Corr, which is the state Democrat chairman. He was from Sanborn, Indiana, and of course, Matt Welch was from Vincennes. So anyway, they decided that, and got together, that they wanted to promote Matt for governor. So of course, John was one of the guys that helped him out. And so Uncle John was really smart, because he did not run for office, but he was always behind the person that was in the office. And so, of course, he worked with Matt, so Matt got elected. And so, of course, the year Matt was elected was the year I graduated, was in, 61 when I graduated from school. Matt was elected, and Kennedy was elected. And so anyway, there were several of us that we worked at the state office building that summer before I went to college. Well, of course, it was always real neat, because Uncle John would be in the governor's office a lot. And and the governor's secretary was B. Dixon, which had been Uncle John's secretary when he had his office, and did have his office there in the Circle Tower building. So, of course, if I wanted to impress my friends, I'd say, well, hey, let's just go to the governor's office. So we trot over, we was over in the state office building, go through either outside or through the tunnel, and go over to the governor's office. And of course, if you've been to the State House, the big governor's office and all that. So naturally, B would always be there. So if Matt wasn't in the office, which a lot of times he wasn't, she'd let myself and my friends go in the governor's office. And of course, it was always real neat, so we could sit at the governor's desk, and I thought, that's just really the great thing to do, And so that was really neat. So then of course, in his later life, he had connections, and of course, he had this chance to buy this property out in Martinsville, which was out off of 252, and so that's how they started Painted Hills, which was a big development with two big lakes. And at that time, he was friends with Skunk Irving, which was Irving Materials in Greenfield. And then also he was a good friend of Hildebrand, that had Hildebrand Industries at Batesville. And in fact, there's a bunch of them, and they would take trips in Hildebrand's airplane every spring up to Michigan to get mushrooms. So anyway, he got those as investors. So anyway, as investors, that's how they started Painted Hills. And that was a very successful thing. Of course, it's still in operation now. And then they also started the cemetery there, Mount Eagle Cemetery, and they had that for several years. Well, when they built were building out at Painted Hills, the property owners, they needed water supply. And Martinsville Water, they did not want to pump water out there. So John said, well, heck, we'll just do our own. So they built their own, drilled their own wells out on Crabertown Loop, so they had their own water company. And so through the years, that's some of the things that he did that was successful and so forth. So
now he is the Sagamore of the Wabash.
Right.
Is,
And yeah, he has, the Sagamore of the Wabash, there's, I think he has 4 or 5 of those, and the Kentucky Colonel, and of course he was in all kinds of activities. He was the national director of the Lions Club, and Disciples of Christ that was in, down at Nashville, Tennessee. And oh yeah, the list of, I mean, it's pages of the different organizations and the different things that he was in. Of course, all the bar associations and the athletic club in Indianapolis, and just a whole slew of those that he was always involved in.
But the Sagamore and the Wabash is the
Sagamore, yeah.
Is the highest.
Yeah.
The thing you can receive is the Hoosier,
right?
And he has 5.
5 of those.
It's just amazing,
right.
And then
it has to be given to you by the governor.
And the other thing that was so impressive that Randy Marsh has shared is that he has a signed photo from FDR,
right?
And then a personally signed one from Truman,
right.
JFK, and Johnson,
right?
Which is just amazing what he has accomplished.
Right.
The last thing we'll finish up with here is the history projects. Your granddaughter Carson did a phenomenal job on her report on John Hurt, and then your grandson Brock, what has he accomplished with this?
Okay, his project is doing the Indiana homestead, where you do all the research of a piece of property that has been in the family for at least 100 years. And so he went down to, he and I went down to Martinsville to the assessor's office, where you get your paper and they will do research, but then you have to go back into the building, or excuse me, into the room where all of the books of all the recorded deeds for Morgan County, and huge books, and they go from floor to ceiling. And so he did all the research to get all those together and made copies of, and then you send that with a paperwork that you have to do to the Department of Agriculture in Indianapolis, and so that we are accepted. And so there will be a presentation the 20th of March, 2 weeks from today. And so as a family, we go to the State House, and there'll be several families. There's one other family from Morgan County, and that we get the presentation from the Lieutenant Governor and have our picture taken, and so he'll go to that and so forth. And I hope that they can say something about that this is his project. And I'll try to talk to them ahead of time, because he did a lot of work on it.
It was a huge accomplishment.
So, oh yes, right, yeah, because it's a lot of work to get all those deeds, because when you go through those books and so forth, why you have to really work at it and go from one book to the other. I think he was in 5 or 6 different books and so forth. So yeah, he's done that.
So this was our interview today with Jeanne Shupe. So I'd like to thank you for your interview. And
well, you're welcome.
So.
And I hope I answered all my questions.